Have you ever tasted $1,000 champagne, only to find it bitter as mud? That is the flavor of ultimate betrayal. My boss thought firing me via text at a glamorous gala would silence me. Instead of crying, I spent exactly 48 hours turning her billion-dollar logistics empire into legal scrap metal. Want to know how to erase a company in 2 days? Sit down. This is not a business lesson. It is a corporate execution. Hello and welcome to Boss Revenge Stories. We are so incredibly grateful for your time and continued support. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently disabled our monetization features, leaving us with zero budget to operate, which means we are forced to halt all new video uploads here in the near future and shift our operations entirely to Patreon. If you find yourself enjoying today's story, please graciously support us by joining our Patreon channel to listen to exclusive, true stories that are even better, featuring much longer runtimes and deeply detailed situations that we simply cannot publicize on YouTube, all performed with multiple emotional voices in the same story, which you can access right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or the comments section of this video. Now, let us begin today's story and see this corporate execution through the eyes of our main character, Piper Campbell. The air inside the grand ballroom in downtown Chicago was thick with the scent of overpriced designer cologne, roasted duck, and corporate lies. I stood near the edge of the champagne fountain. A 30-year-old chief artificial intelligence freight systems architect, gripping a flute of dark red wine so tightly my knuckles turned white. Above me, massive crystal chandeliers threw blinding, fractured light across the room, illuminating the most powerful people of the American logistics industry. There was endless, hollow social laughter echoing off the marble walls, the kind of laughter that cost thousands of dollars per plate to produce. I hated every single second of it. But as the technical brain behind Nexara Freight Dynamics, my presence was a mandatory prop. Suddenly, the phone in my silk pocket buzzed with a sharp, dry vibration. I pulled it out, squinting against the glare of the ballroom. It was a single text message from Valerie Sterling, the untouchable female chief executive officer of Nexara. The words on the screen were clinical, aggressive, and entirely devoid of any human warmth. "You are fired. Hand over your devices to security. Do not make a scene here." My breath caught in my throat, freezing my lungs. I slowly raised my eyes and looked across the vast expanse of the ballroom. There she was. Valerie was wrapped in a tailored emerald gown, standing effortlessly next to a state senator. She raised her glass, throwing her head back in a practiced, photogenic laugh, completely ignoring my existence across the floor. To her, throwing away the woman who built her entire technical infrastructure was no different than discarding a used paper towel after drying her hands. She did not even have the basic human decency to look me in the eye. The realization hit me with the force of a speeding freight train. It was never about my performance. Just this afternoon, I had breached a restricted server and discovered the terrifying truth about our company. Nexara's environmental, social, and governance data system was entirely fabricated. It was a complete fake. Valerie was firing me tonight to bury the evidence and legitimize the paperwork needed to secure a federal grant worth hundreds of millions of dollars by Monday morning, by kicking me out of the building. She was silencing the only person who knew the truth, and simultaneously stealing the revolutionary optimization algorithm I had spent 3 years coding from scratch. A hot, venomous anger boiled up in my chest, threatening to spill over. I wanted to scream, to flip the nearest caviar station, to tear that emerald dress right off her back. But as I stood there, actively suppressing the rage that was shaking my hands, a tall figure stepped into my peripheral vision. It was Julian Vance, a notorious venture capitalist, a ruthless vulture investor known across Silicon Valley for swooping in and devouring dying companies. He leaned casually against a pillar beside me, smelling of black coffee and expensive leather. He slid a sleek black business card between his index and middle fingers, extending it toward me. "You look like someone who just received a death sentence. or just got liberated. Coffee? He whispered, his voice cutting through the noise of the gala like a razor. I looked at his card, then back to my glass. The anger in my veins suddenly turned into something else. It turned cold. It turned calculated. I lifted the wine glass to my lips and downed the bitter liquid in one smooth swallow. I handed the empty glass to a passing waiter and flashed Julian a cold, razor-sharp smile, without turning back to look at Valerie even one single time. I turned on my heels and walked straight out of the grand hall, leaving the glittering lights and fake laughter behind me. The heavy wooden doors shut with a resounding thud. The clock had just struck 10 on Friday night. The countdown had officially started. The elevator doors slid open at exactly 1 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. Julian Vance's penthouse office was a glass and steel fortress suspended above the glittering grid of the city, cast in the dim, bluish glow of massive multi-monitor trading terminals. There were no tears streaming down my face. There was no pathetic whining about how unfairly I'd been treated. I bypassed the luxury leather couches entirely, walking straight to the massive oak conference table in the center of the room. I dropped a heavy, sealed cylinder onto the wood, popped the cap, and unrolled the master system architecture blueprints of the company I had just been exiled from. Julian handed me a mug of black coffee. He leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the incredibly complex web of routing nodes and data flow charts I was pinning down. The eco-friendly fleet she parades around to secure venture capital and government grants does not exist, I stated, my voice as flat and unyielding as concrete. They are ghosts. Julian frowned, tracing a line of data architecture with his index finger. Explain. She weaponized my own routing algorithms, I said, tapping a cluster of red nodes on the schematic. I built the system to optimize fuel efficiency and minimize environmental impact. Valerie isolated that logic module and inverted it. She instructed the system to generate millions of data points for phantom electric vehicles driving perfect, zero-emission routes. Meanwhile, the actual physical freight is being hauled by aging, heavy diesel rigs that vomit carbon into the atmosphere at rates well above the federal legal limit. She is choking the sky to suppress operational costs, while simultaneously pocketing green energy subsidies. Julian straightened up. The realization washed over his face, replaced quickly by a predator's grin. He began pacing the length of the room. The sheer scale of this fraud is staggering, he said, his mind clearly racing through the financial implications. When this goes public, the Securities and Exchange Commission will bring the hammer down. The stock price will instantly vaporize. We can short the stock, leak the documents, and make a fortune while she burns. I took a slow sip of the scalding coffee, letting the heat center me. A crashing stock price is an inconvenience for her, a temporary wound. She will hire a crisis management firm, blame a rogue technical failure, fire a few scapegoats, and survive. I do not want her to bleed. I want Nexara completely stripped of its ability to function. I pulled a secondary document from my leather bag. It was a heavily redacted internal financial lease agreement. I slid it across the smooth wood toward him, tapping my fingernail against a specific clause buried on page 42. Look at the fine print on their equipment leases, I instructed. Julian picked up the document, his eyes narrowing as he read the dense legal jargon. A covenant default clause. Exactly, I replied. Nexara does not actually own a single one of their 5,000 heavy-duty trucks. They lease the entire fleet from a syndicate of 3 major commercial banks. That specific clause states that if the lessee is formally accused of federal environmental fraud, the lending institutions maintain the right to instantly terminate the lease and trigger an immediate repossession of all physical assets to mitigate their own liability. Julian tossed the paper back onto the table. You want to trigger the default. I want to trigger the default, and I want you to buy the toxic debt from those panicked banks the second they try to offload it, I said, meeting his gaze evenly. You have the limitless capital and the shadow network of shell companies to make those quiet acquisitions. I have the irrefutable data to force their hand. Julian crossed his arms, staring at me with a mixture of intense calculation and genuine respect. Even if I buy the debt and we repossess the fleet, The market demands that freight keeps moving. The supply chain cannot just halt. The clients will panic. They will not have to, I countered smoothly. For the past 18 months, I have been spending my weekends quietly building a proprietary, fully independent logistics platform. I call it AeroShift. It is cleaner, faster, and infinitely more stable than the rotting infrastructure Valerie is currently running. When Nexara's servers crash, AeroShift will be standing by, fully operational, ready to catch every single orphaned contract. A heavy silence fell over the penthouse. The ambient hum of the city below seemed to fade away as the magnitude of the strategy settled in the room. This was not a simple whistleblowing operation. This was a hostile, surgical extraction of an entire corporate empire. "We form a syndicate tonight," Julian finally said, his voice dropping an octave. "My money, your software, our mutual destruction of Valerie Sterling." "Agreed," I said, extending my hand. He shook it. His grip was firm, sealing the pact. The objective was firmly locked into place. We were not just going to expose a lie. We were going to systematically sever the financial arteries of Nexara, legally confiscate all 5,000 of their trucks, and leave them with absolutely zero means of moving a single cardboard box. And we were going to do it all before the opening bell rang on the New York Stock Exchange this Monday morning. By the time the hazy light of Saturday morning began to filter through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the penthouse, the operation was already in full swing. I was sitting cross-legged on the hardwood floor, surrounded by an array of 4 massive, curved monitors. The golden rule of any digital demolition is remarkably simple. You never break into a house when you can just look through the transparent windows. Hacking directly into Nexara's mainframe would inevitably leave a digital fingerprint, a microscopic trail of breadcrumbs that Valerie's highly paid corporate lawyers could easily use to drag me into a federal court for cyber espionage. I did not need to breach their heavily guarded internal servers to prove her guilt. I just needed to look at the open sky. Our modern world is constantly drowning in publicly available data, provided you know exactly where to look and how to catch it. I began by pulling massive streams of open-source satellite imagery from commercial orbital networks. Following that, I tapped directly into the public application programming interfaces of the Department of Transportation. I aggressively scraped the live, unencrypted feeds from highway toll booths, way stations, and municipal traffic cameras spread across the entire North American continent. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic, heavy clacking filling the otherwise silent room. I was writing a highly aggressive, multi-threaded script in Python. The logic I built was elegant, complex, and utterly ruthless. The script was specifically designed to utilize optical character recognition to automatically scan those high-resolution public traffic camera feeds, isolating and identifying the license plates of heavy commercial freight trucks. The moment the code captured a physical license plate legally registered to Nexara Freight Dynamics on a public highway, it immediately cross-referenced that specific vehicle's real-world location and its registered diesel exhaust output with the fabricated zero-emissions daily operational logs that Valerie was mandated to submit to the government databases. For 6 solid hours, I did not eat, I did not sleep, and I barely even blinked. I drank 3 cups of black tea and let the code compile. When the heavy processing finally finished and the millions of data points aligned, the results materialized into a stunning interactive online graphical interface. I named the web portal the Phantom Fleet. It was a digital map of the United States, cloaked in a dark charcoal interface. Every single time my script detected a discrepancy between the real world and Valerie's lies, a bright, glowing red beacon would pulse on the map. Within 10 seconds of the server going live, the entire eastern seaboard and the Midwest lit up like a massive, bleeding wound. There were thousands upon thousands of red dots multiplying across the screen. Each individual dot represented a heavy, outdated diesel truck actively spewing toxic exhaust while hauling freight down a highway, while Valerie's fraudulent internal system simultaneously reported that very same route as being flawlessly executed by a clean electric vehicle. The visual evidence was absolute and indisputable. It was a towering digital monument to her massive, illegal deception, updating in real time for anyone to see. While I was busy building the digital execution weapon, Julian was meticulously preparing the financial body bags. Across the expansive room, he was pacing back and forth across a Persian rug, wearing a wireless headset, his voice a low, commanding murmur. He was rapidly mobilizing his extensive shadow network of offshore holding entities and shell companies based out of Delaware. He instructed his elite teams of aggressive corporate attorneys to immediately draft highly specific, ironclad debt acquisition contracts. They were laying down the complex legal framework required to swoop in and purchase the toxic vehicle leases from the three major commercial banks the very second those lending institutions realized they were holding on to a radioactive, fraudulent asset. Julian was setting a massive financial bear trap, leaving the steel jaws wide open and patiently waiting for the panicked market to step right into it. With the exposure mechanism completely finalized, I pivoted my attention to our containment strategy. If we successfully destroyed Nexara, a massive, catastrophic vacuum would open up in the national supply chain. I opened the master repository for AeroShift, the proprietary, next-generation logistics platform I had been secretly developing in my spare time over the last 2 years. I initiated the rapid migration protocols, seamlessly integrating my authentic, highly optimized routing algorithms into the AeroShift cloud infrastructure. I rapidly provisioned dozens of elastic servers, aggressively scaling up the processing power and bandwidth to a massive enterprise-grade level. AeroShift was no longer just a brilliant prototype living securely on my local hard drive. It was now a fully operational, military-grade logistical net, primed and ready to automatically absorb tens of thousands of stranded client orders the exact moment Valerie's rotting corporate infrastructure collapsed under the immense weight of the incoming scandal. I meticulously engineered the customer onboarding process to be completely frictionless, ensuring that any panicked Nexara client could legally transition their entire multi-million-dollar freight portfolio over to my secure, 100% environmentally compliant system with a single click of a button. By late Saturday afternoon, the ambient light in the office had shifted to a deep, bruised orange as the sun began to set over the skyline. Everything was perfectly aligned. The digital bomb was fully constructed, heavily armed, and securely wired to detonate. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, rolling my shoulders to release the intense muscular tension that had built up over the day. I exported the live interactive web link for the Phantom Fleet, encrypting the Origin Internet Protocol address through a complex labyrinth of 7 different virtual private networks spanning across 3 separate continents to ensure absolute, unbreakable anonymity. I drafted a completely sterile, untraceable email containing nothing but the web link and a brief yet clinical sentence explaining how to interpret the raw data. With one final, decisive strike of the Enter key, I deployed the payload. The encrypted message flew silently through the digital ether, landing simultaneously in the private inboxes of the senior investigative editors at 3 of the largest and most respected financial newspapers in the country, as well as the anonymous whistleblower portal of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. The match had been struck, and we had just casually tossed it directly into Valerie Sterling's powder keg. The sun rose on Sunday morning, bringing with it a very special kind of digital earthquake. At exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, the Wall Street Journal published their highly anticipated digital Sunday edition, right there on the front page. Dominating the screen with a massive, bold headline was the spectacular culmination of my Saturday labor. The biggest environmental fraud of the decade, the truth behind the Nexara empire. The investigative journalists had absolutely devoured the raw data I sent them, aggressively verifying the satellite discrepancies with their own independent environmental experts overnight. The resulting article was a masterpiece of financial journalism, ruthlessly dissecting every single lie Valerie Sterling had told the public and her investors over the past 3 years. I was sitting at a tiny, wobbly wooden table in a modest corner cafe, wearing an oversized gray sweater and comfortable jeans. I took a slow, deliberate bite of a warm, buttery croissant. The flaky pastry crumbled onto my ceramic plate, As I took a sip of a very ordinary, yet completely delicious, drip coffee, my laptop was open in front of me, not to write more code, but purely to enjoy the spectacular morning show. I was securely logged into several anonymous corporate employee forums, watching the internal communications of Nexara Freight Dynamics spontaneously combust in real time. The message boards were a glorious chaotic mess of pure, unadulterated panic. Junior developers were posting frantic, terrified messages about federal agents inevitably raiding the office by Monday. Mid-level managers were desperately asking if their lucrative stock options were now completely worthless pieces of paper. Through the continuous stream of anonymous leaks, I could perfectly visualize the magnificent disaster currently unfolding inside the glass-walled executive suites. Valerie was evidently screaming at the top of her lungs, demanding that the remaining software engineering team immediately scrub the main servers and permanently delete any trace of the routing manipulation. There was just one massive, hilarious problem with her aggressive command. The architecture of that specific data infrastructure was incredibly dense, built on a highly customized, intricate web of algorithmic logic that only one person in the entire world fully understood. That person was currently eating a croissant and actively ignoring 17 consecutive missed calls from the Nexara executive suite. Without my specific administrative clearance and my foundational knowledge of the deeply buried codebase, her highly paid technical team was just staring blankly at glowing monitors, completely locked out of the core system. They could not hide the digital bodies, because I had taken the only shovel with me when I was escorted out of the Gala. By noon, the sheer weight of the impending public relations disaster forced Valerie into a dark corner. She executed a remarkably desperate and entirely predictable maneuver. Nexara issued a highly aggressive emergency press release to all major national news outlets. The statement completely bypassed taking any corporate responsibility whatsoever. Instead, it claimed that the massive data irregularities were the direct result of malicious, unauthorized digital tampering by a highly disgruntled, recently terminated former employee. She was pointing a giant, glowing neon finger directly at me. It was a classic Valerie move, attempting to throw a loyal subordinate directly under the moving bus to save her own expensive tailored suits. A normal person might have panicked at this point. A normal person might have immediately called a defamation lawyer, drafted a furious public denial, and prepared for a miserable, drawn-out legal battle in the press. But I was not a normal person, and I was certainly not playing defense. I did not waste a single breath issuing a public denial. Instead, I used her desperate press release as the ultimate free marketing campaign. Within 10 minutes of her statement hitting the wire, I officially pulled the curtain back on AeroShift. I unlocked the public-facing portal of my newly migrated cloud platform and launched a highly targeted, automated email campaign directed straight at the inbox of every single corporate client, logistics partner, and supply chain vendor currently doing business with Nexara. My message was short, entirely professional, and absolutely devastating. Are you concerned about sudden supply chain disruptions and massive legal liabilities tied to the recent environmental, social, and governance fraud allegations? Do not let your freight stop moving. AeroShift is ready to absorb your operational volume immediately. We are offering a 30-day completely free emergency trial for all stranded Nexara partners, backed by an ironclad 100% environmental compliance guarantee. I offered them a fully functional, legally safe lifeboat right as they were watching the Nexara Titanic scrape against the massive iceberg. The psychological warfare was genuinely beautiful to witness. Corporate loyalty in the cutthroat logistics industry only extends as far as the profit margins and legal safety. Absolutely nobody wanted to be caught holding hands with a toxic company that was about to be obliterated by the Securities and Exchange Commission. By Sunday night, the initial trickle of defections turned into a massive, unstoppable flood. Corporate fear is the ultimate catalyst for swift business decisions. At exactly 11 o'clock that evening, my secure server pinged with a digital notification that made my heart soar. Nexara's absolute largest enterprise client, a massive multinational retail conglomerate that accounted for roughly 40% of Valerie's entire quarterly revenue, had officially signed an electronic memorandum of understanding with AeroShift. They transitioned their entire global freight portfolio over to my secure servers in the middle of the night, utterly terrified of the severe legal fallout if they remained tied to a fraudulent fleet for even one more day. The mass exodus had officially begun. Valerie was rapidly bleeding out on the corporate floor, and the dreaded market opening on Monday morning was still hours away. As Sunday bled into a cold, pitch-black night, the pacing of our operation accelerated from a steady, calculated march into a full-blown, breathless sprint. The financial markets in Asia and Europe were just beginning to wake up, stretching their limbs before the massive American exchanges opened, and Julian Vance was waiting for them in the dark with a loaded gun, sitting in his penthouse, illuminated only by the harsh, clinical glare of his multi-monitor trading terminals. He officially initiated the financial slaughter. Julian picked up his secure phone and gave a single, quiet command to his prime brokers. He activated a massive, heavily leveraged short sell order against Nexara Freight Dynamics. We are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars entirely positioned to bet on the absolute destruction of Valerie Sterling's corporate empire. He utilized dark pools of liquidity to mask the initial buildup, but as the early trading hours commenced overseas in Tokyo and London, the immense volume of Julian's aggressive downward pressure hit the stock like a kinetic bombardment. The share price did not just drop, it completely fell off a cliff. It plummeted into a terrifying, uncontrollable freefall, shedding massive percentages of its value by the minute. He was ruthlessly driving the valuation into a deep crater before the New York sun even had a chance to rise over the horizon. That violent, spectacular market reaction was the exact catalyst we needed to trigger the final, most devastating phase of our strategy. By midnight, the official confirmation that the United States Securities and Exchange Commission was launching a full-scale, expedited investigation into the environmental fraud had hit the private financial wires. Inside the towering glass headquarters of the three major commercial banks that actually owned Nexara's physical vehicles, massive red alarms were absolutely deafening. These conservative lending institutions were suddenly holding the bag on a highly radioactive, federally investigated corporate disaster. The risk of being legally categorized as accomplices to a massive federal grant fraud, or having their assets frozen by federal agents, was absolutely unacceptable to their frantic risk management committees. Emergency conference calls were established in the dead of night. Vice presidents in wrinkled dress shirts yelled over each other, demanding a total and immediate divestment from Valerie Sterling. They frantically scrambled to pull the emergency brake. With a few aggressive keystrokes from their legal departments, they officially triggered the covenant default. They instantly and unilaterally terminated the leases, legally stripping Nexara of any right to operate the vehicles. But the banks were still in a state of sheer panic. They now possessed 5,000 heavy-duty trucks that were legally tied to a massive federal crime scene, and they desperately wanted those toxic, depreciating assets entirely off their balance sheets before the American financial markets opened and the press started asking questions. That is precisely when our ghost entity materialized from the shadows. The heavily obscured shell company Julian and I had quietly established in Delaware aggressively approached the panicked banking syndicates. We did not send them a polite email. We did not offer them a structured payment plan. We offered them a brutal, immediate, and highly lucrative exit strategy. Julian's elite team of high-powered corporate attorneys slid a strictly non-negotiable proposal across the digital table. We offered to purchase the entirety of the defaulted lease contracts, acquiring the full legal title for the entire fleet of 5,000 trucks at a steep 40% discount. And the absolute kicker? We offered to pay for it all in pure, untraceable liquid cash, transferred immediately upon signature. The bankers were trapped in a terrifying corner, sweating through their expensive suits, watching the pre-market value of Nexara completely disintegrate on their monitors. They needed immediate liquidity, and they needed to sever their ties with Valerie instantly to protect their own careers. The offer was predatory, it was insulting, and it was their only way out. To cut their massive losses and run from the burning building, they completely capitulated. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, the final, decisive blow was struck. Sitting in the quiet, focused hum of Julian's office, I opened the heavily encrypted digital transfer portal provided by the banks. I meticulously reviewed the final terms of the massive asset acquisition with one smooth, deliberate motion. I applied my verified electronic signature to the bottom of the master contract. The massive cash transfer cleared through the federal wire system instantly. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, exhaling a long, trembling breath that I felt like I had been holding for 2 straight days. As of that exact second, Piper Campbell was the sole, undisputed legal owner of every single heavy transport vehicle currently bearing the Nexara logo across the entire North American continent. But owning the metal was simply not enough. I knew Valerie's arrogance intimately. I needed to ensure she could not simply ignore the law and force her exhausted drivers to start their engines through sheer intimidation and threats of termination. I opened a direct, encrypted uplink to the centralized global positioning system network that controlled the onboard telemetry computers of the entire newly acquired fleet. I cracked my knuckles and wrote a rapid, highly aggressive line of code, an absolute, unbreakable electronic kill switch. I broadcasted the legal lockdown command directly to all 5,000 trucks currently parked in depots and truck stops scattered across the country. The sophisticated command forcibly rewrote their ignition protocols, instructing the engine control units that they were strictly forbidden from turning over the next morning unless they received a highly specific, newly generated cryptographic authentication code. And that specific code could only be generated and distributed by the master servers of their new legal operator, AeroShift. On my monitor, 5,000 green status icons simultaneously flipped to a solid, locked crimson red. The fleet was completely paralyzed. Every single exit door had been aggressively slammed shut, deadbolted, and welded locked. We had choked off her operating capital, legally stolen her largest clients, and aggressively repossessed her entire physical infrastructure while she was completely oblivious to the massacre. Across the city, in her sprawling, multi-million-dollar mansion, Valerie Sterling was still sleeping soundly in her imported silk sheets. She was resting peacefully, breathing softly, arrogantly believing that when the sun came up, she could simply utilize her massive corporate war chest to hire expensive lobbyists in Washington and smoothly bribe her way out of the impending crisis. She had absolutely no idea that she was going to wake up as the captain of a ship that had already been sitting quietly at the bottom of the dark ocean for hours. At exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning, the atmosphere inside the Nexara executive boardroom was suffocating. Valerie Sterling stood at the head of the massive frosted glass table, her voice entirely too loud, desperately trying to project authority to the terrified board of directors. "Everything is perfectly under control," she lied through her teeth, aggressively slapping her manicured hand onto the table. "The media is blowing a minor discrepancy way out of proportion. We still possess our entire operational fleet. Delivery schedules will proceed normally this morning to reassure the market and our investors. This is merely a temporary public relations hurdle that we will easily overcome by tomorrow." Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung wide open, hitting the drywall with a sharp, echoing crack. I confidently walked into the room, my footsteps sounding loud against the polished marble floor. I was wearing the exact same navy blue suit that Valerie had once sneered at, a suit she had explicitly called entirely too cheap to ever be worn in front of important clients. Flanking me on my right was Julian Vance, looking exactly like a hungry shark that had just smelled blood in the water. Trailing just a few steps behind him were 3 heavily armed corporate litigators dressed in immaculate charcoal suits. Holding thick leather briefcases, Valerie's face immediately contorted in pure, unadulterated fury at the sight of me. "Where is building security?" she shrieked, pointing a violently trembling finger at my face. Have this woman physically removed from the premises immediately. This is a private executive meeting." But the room remained completely and utterly silent. Not a single board member moved a muscle to press their hidden panic buttons. Julian had spent the early hours of the morning making several extremely lucrative phone calls to their private numbers, successfully purchasing their complete and absolute silence with promises of immunity from the impending federal fallout. I did not break eye contact with Valerie for even a fraction of a second as I walked calmly toward the head of the table. I lifted the heavy stack of legally certified ownership contracts and tossed them effortlessly onto the glass. The thick documents landed with a heavy, definitive thud right in front of her perfectly manicured hands. "Your dispatchers are probably telling you right now that the drivers cannot start their engines this morning," I said, my voice smooth, steady, and perfectly level. "You probably assumed it was just another system glitch caused by the server migration. It is not a glitch. Valerie, they cannot start their trucks because their onboard computers received a mandatory change of ownership notification at exactly 3 o'clock this morning. I bought your defaulted debt in pure cash. I own the metal now." I leaned forward, resting both of my hands firmly on the glass table, closing the distance between us. "If you intentionally order a single one of those drivers to bypass the electronic lock and put a truck in drive today, you will be actively committing federal grand theft auto on 5,000 separate counts." Valerie stared down at the legally binding documents, the expensive spray tan on her skin seemingly turning the color of wet ash. She opened her mouth to speak, to yell, to issue another command, but absolutely no sound came out. Her throat was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the trap that had just snapped shut around her. I looked directly into the eyes of the woman who genuinely thought she could throw me away like a piece of used garbage. "You fired me because you arrogantly thought I was just a disposable pawn standing in your way," I said, making sure every single word dripped with cold finality. "But you completely forgot who actually builds the engine and pours the fuel into your machine. Today, Nexera has no vehicles, absolutely no operational data, and 0 remaining clients. Your company is officially obsolete." The last remaining ounce of fight entirely drained out of Valerie's body. Her knees visibly gave out, and she collapsed heavily into her plush leather executive chair. She sat there completely frozen, staring blankly at the wall ahead, finally comprehending the devastating reality that her billion-dollar corporate empire had completely evaporated over the course of exactly 2 weekend days. There was absolutely no legal loophole, no emergency bailout, and no political bribe left in the world to resurrect it. I turned my back on the beautiful wreckage I had created and walked out of the boardroom without looking back. 20 minutes later, I stepped out of the suffocating corporate headquarters and out into the crisp, bright Monday morning air. I walked out of those revolving doors as the newly minted Chief Executive Officer of AeroShift. High above the entrance, a dedicated crew of maintenance workers was already standing on a hydraulic lift, actively unbolting the giant glowing Nexara logo from the glass facade. I stood alone on the bustling sidewalk, bathed in the warm morning sunlight, and genuinely smiled. Sometimes, the most flawless and devastating revenge in the world does not require shouting or physical destruction. The absolute most perfect revenge is simply allowing the undeniable truth and your own quiet, undeniable skills to speak entirely for themselves. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for listening to today's story. Please let me know in the comments exactly where in the world you are tuning in from today. If you found today's corporate execution thrilling and enjoyed the story, I must gently remind you that our channel has unfortunately lost its monetization features, and we have 0 budget left to operate. Because of this, we are forced to stop uploading new videos here in the very near future, and we will be moving our operations entirely over to Patreon. Please graciously help us survive and continue our work by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community. There, you can listen to our absolute best, highly exclusive true stories that are way too intense and incredibly detailed for us to ever publish publicly on YouTube. You can easily join us right now by simply scanning the Patreon QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by clicking the link provided in the description or the pinned comment below.